Picture this. You're standing in the middle of the Colosseum. 50,000 Romans are screaming all around you. The sand beneath your feet is soaked with the blood of men who came before you. A gladiator lifts his sword above his head. The crowd erupts. And somewhere up in the imperial box, a thumb decides whether you breathe another day. That's the image we've all grown up with, isn't it? Roman justice at its most raw. Fight hard enough, impress the crowd enough, and maybe, just maybe, you walk out of that arena alive. But there's something the history books never told you. Something Hollywood has been leaving out for decades. The arena, the blood-soaked spectacle you've been imagining your whole life. That was actually the merciful option. That was the quick way out, because Rome had something else entirely. A sentence so carefully designed, so deliberately constructed, that the Romans themselves had a name for it. They called it the living death. And once you understand what actually happened inside that punishment, you will never look at the Roman Empire the same way again. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it right now before we go any further. Because what you're about to hear is the kind of history that gets buried on purpose. Let's start with something fundamental. The Romans did not think the way we think. When we hear the word prison today, we think rehabilitation, second chances, reform. To a Roman, that entire concept would have seemed laughable. Their prisons, places like the notorious Tullianum, were nothing more than waiting rooms, temporary spaces where you sat until your real punishment began. Because Rome was never interested in fixing you. Rome was interested in making an example of you in the most efficient way possible. And they had perfected something far more terrifying than a quick execution. They had perfected erasure. The moment a Roman judge spoke those two words, ad metalla, you stopped existing as a human being under the law. Your citizenship was gone instantly. Everything you owned was seized by the state. Your marriage was legally dissolved. Your children were no longer yours in any legal sense. You couldn't own property, inherit wealth, or even write a will. Roman legal scholars had a specific term for what you had become. Damnatus, the condemned. You were no longer classified as a person. You were reclassified as an instrument, a tool owned by the state, with the exact same legal standing as a plough or a hammer sitting in someone's barn. The Roman legal scholar Ulpian wrote that those condemned to the mines lose both their liberty and their citizenship by virtue of the punishment itself, even before they arrive at the place of punishment. You were legally dead before you ever laid eyes on a mine shaft. Now, who actually received this sentence? Common criminals, yes, but also political enemies who threatened the wrong people. Prisoners of war who survived long enough to be useful. And in enormous numbers, early Christians who the Roman state viewed as a destabilizing force. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Cyprian didn't mince words about what this was. They called it state-sponsored murder stretched across years rather than seconds. But here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. Damnatio ad metalla wasn't just punishment. It was a business model. The Roman Empire ran on minerals. Silver for coins, gold for temples and monuments, iron for weapons and armor, lead for the aqueducts that brought water into cities, marble for every grand building that made Rome look eternal. Mining all of this was extraordinarily dangerous work that killed free laborers at a staggering rate. So Rome solved two problems with one sentence. You punish your enemies, and you fill your labor shortage at the same time. Spain's silver mines at Rio Tinto, Dacia's gold operations, Egypt's stone quarries at Mons Claudianus. These were not just places of punishment. These were the economic engine of the empire running at full capacity. That coin sitting in a Roman's purse was almost certainly mined by someone who had been legally erased from society. The marble on the temple wall was cut by hands that belonged to people Rome had decided no longer existed. The empire's glory was built, quite literally, on the slow deaths of the forgotten. Now let me take you through what this actually looked like from the inside. Your sentencing is over. The journey to damnation begins immediately. You are chained at the neck and ankles and attached to a line of other condemned men and women. If you were sentenced in Rome and destined for the Spanish mines, you were looking at an 800-mile journey on foot, weeks of walking in iron chains. The guards had no interest in your well-being. If you fell behind, you were dragged. If dragging didn't work, you were beaten. If you still couldn't move, you were executed on the spot and left on the road. Entire convoys regularly arrived at mines with 30 to 40% fewer prisoners than they had started with. The historian Diodorus Siculus described how the newly condemned would arrive already half destroyed from the march, their spirits broken before they had struck a single blow against rock. Then you arrive, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Sulfur, rotting flesh, human waste, sweat baked into stone, smoke from hundreds of oil lamps burning in tunnels with no ventilation. A stench so overwhelming that new arrivals vomited immediately upon entering. Then you see the workers already inside. Hundreds of prisoners, barely recognizable as human beings. Skeletal remains recovered from Roman mining sites, says, how shattered vertebrae, bones deformed by severe malnutrition, lungs coated black with silica dust. The Greek geographer Agatharchides visited the Egyptian gold mines and wrote exactly what he saw. Those condemned to the mines are worked continuously both by day and by night. No relaxation is given to the sick. No consideration is shown to the weak. All are compelled by blows to keep working until, overcome by ill treatment, they die in the midst of their torments. These wretches deem their future more dreadful than the present, and they long for death as more desirable than life. Your shift ran 10 to 12 hours. In underground operations, you descended hundreds of feet into absolute darkness. The only light came from small oil lamps that barely reached the rock face and filled the already toxic air with more smoke. Temperatures underground could hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Combined with the humidity, men collapsed from heat exhaustion within hours of starting a shift. Your tools were basic. A small pick, a hammer, sometimes nothing but your bare hands scraping at rock. Your quota was set beyond what was physically achievable, guaranteeing that you always fell short, always gave Rome a reason to apply more pressure, and you worked, chained, always chained, connected to other prisoners so that every single movement required coordination. The chains weren't just to prevent escape. They were calibrated so that when cave-ins happened, which they did constantly, multiple prisoners would die together rather than one at a time. The Romans had actually calculated acceptable loss ratios and designed the restraint system around them. The air itself was killing you, regardless of anything else. Silica dust settling into your lungs every hour of every shift. There is a disease called silicosis, where that dust literally calcifies your lung tissue, turns it to stone. Over time, you would begin coughing blood within months. Within 2 years, you would be drowning without any water in sight. The Romans used a mining technique called fire setting, heating rock faces with open flames and then pouring cold water over them to create fractures. This made the work faster, and it made the mines catastrophically unstable. Entire sections collapsed without warning and without any possibility of survival. When cave-ins happened, Rome did not mount rescue operations. They sealed off that tunnel and opened a new shaft somewhere else. The collapsed section became a permanent mass grave. Archaeological excavations at Rio Tinto have found human remains still wearing their chains, still clutching their tools, buried exactly where they fell 2,000 years ago. Your food was 1 meal per day. Diodorus described it as a small portion of bread and even less water, amounting to roughly 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day, while performing labor that burned 4,000 to 5,000 calories. You were being slowly starved while simultaneously being worked to death. Prisoners typically lost 30 to 40% of their body weight within the first 6 months. You watched strong men become shadows. You watched them fall. You watched them die and understood you were watching your own future. The sleeping quarters were called ergastula, the same word Romans used for livestock pens. Underground chambers with no ventilation and no sanitation whatsoever. You slept chained in filth, packed tightly with dozens of other prisoners. Disease moved through these spaces without any resistance. Dysentery, typhus, infections from wounds that were never treated because no medical care existed for the damnati. If you became too sick to work, you worked anyway until you physically couldn't, and then you died. Average survival time after arrival: 6 months to 3 years. Very few lasted longer. This was not a side effect of the punishment. This was the punishment. Maximum labor extracted, maximum suffering delivered, efficient, profitable, and carefully managed. Now here is something that needs to be said clearly. We don't know most of their names. The Romans kept meticulous records about almost everything: architecture, military campaigns, tax collection, legal proceedings. But the damnati were erased so completely that the records themselves reflect that erasure. We have fragments. We know from Christian martyr accounts about people like Potamiana of Alexandria. We know about 40 Christians sent to the copper mines at Phaeno in Arabia. Bishop Cyprian wrote letters to imprisoned believers in the mines, attempting to offer comfort to people experiencing suffering he could barely describe. He wrote, "The world regards you as already dead, but in reality you are more alive than those who condemned you." A papyrus from Egypt records a man named Serapion, just his name, condemned ad metalla for theft. What did he steal? Did he have a family waiting somewhere? How long did he survive after arriving? We don't know. That is what erasure looks like when it is applied systematically. But the archaeology is recovering what the records destroyed. Excavations have found graffiti scratched into mine shaft walls by prisoners who knew they would never leave. At Rio Tinto, archaeologists uncovered tally marks carved into stone. Someone was counting their days. One set of marks reaches 237 before stopping. We will never know if that person died or simply gave up keeping count. At Laurium in Greece, someone carved 2 words into the rock: "Remember us," an anonymous plea surviving 2,000 years in the dark. These small acts of resistance, leaving a mark, counting days, asking to be remembered, are heartbreaking, precisely because they were the only resistance available. They couldn't escape, they couldn't fight, but they could scratch 2 words into stone and hope that someday someone would find them and understand that a person had been there. And we have to talk about the children. Roman law permitted the condemnation of entire families, wives, children, even infants could be sentenced alongside the primary accused. Archaeological evidence includes skeletal remains of children as young as 8 to 10 years old, showing identical mining trauma to the adult remains found beside them. Children growing up in underground darkness. Children who knew nothing outside of chains and rock and dust. This was not exceptional. This was systemic. This was Roman justice operating exactly as designed. Now let's address the comparison that always comes up. The arena versus the mines. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was an entirely separate system serving entirely different purposes. This was the lunch break entertainment at gladiatorial games. Unarmed prisoners driven into the arena where lions, bears, and leopards were released. Sometimes they were tied to stakes, sometimes dressed in animal skins to excite the animals further. The outcome was predetermined. Death came within minutes, brutal, public and fast. Seneca the Younger wrote about attending one of these midday spectacles. I come home more greedy, more cruel, and more inhuman beings, because I have been among human beings. He understood what he had witnessed, but even his discomfort reveals the key difference. Arena deaths were visible. They were public. They generated reactions, sometimes sympathy, sometimes horror, and they were expensive. Maintaining exotic animals cost real money, and the condemned died before extracting any economic value. The mines were the opposite on every axis, hidden far from Rome where citizens old never observed them, profitable rather than costly, and the condemned disappeared quietly instead of dying in front of 50,000 witnesses. Later in the empire, as Christianity spread and public executions of martyrs began generating sympathy rather than deterrence, a law from 325 AD instructed judges to prefer mine sentences over arena deaths, not out of mercy, because the mines were better at making people disappear without creating martyrs. The condemned would just vanish and generate revenue while dying in the dark. That single legal shift tells you everything about Roman priorities. Now zoom out and look at the scale of what this was. The empire operated dozens of major mining sites across its territory simultaneously. Rio Tinto, Laurium, the Dacian goldfields. Mons Claudianus, Sardinia, North Africa. Conservative estimates place the total number condemned ad metalla over roughly 4 centuries in the hundreds of thousands. Some scholars put the figure above 1 million, a million people legally erased, their deaths funding the construction of everything Rome left behind. Trajan conquered Dacia in 106 AD, and the gold extracted was so abundant that it funded an entire wave of construction. Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Market, architectural achievements still standing today. The marble in the Pantheon came largely from Mons Claudianus, where prisoners died, cutting it from the earth. The lead pipes delivering water to Roman households were extracted from mines where people suffocated in the dark. The copper in Roman military equipment was mined by people condemned to never hold those tools as free human beings. Tacitus mentions almost casually that Emperor Tiberius sent so many people to the mines that it measurably affected Rome's population. He doesn't express horror. He notes it the same way he'd note a change in weather. That is how completely normalized this was inside the culture that built it, and the Romans were not ignorant of what they were doing. They were not stumbling accidentally into atrocity. They measured productivity in the mines. They adjusted sentencing based on labor needs. When Spanish silver operations required more workers, conviction rates increased. When new quarries opened in Egypt, more condemned prisoners were routed there. This was managed. This was calculated. This was deliberate policy made by educated men who wrote philosophy and built aqueducts and considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization. The monuments remain. The Colosseum still stands and draws millions of visitors every year. People photograph themselves against it. They marvel at the engineering. They buy souvenirs. But the mines are abandoned holes in the earth. No tourists, no preservation efforts, no monuments. Only the occasional skeletal remains that archaeologists uncover, still wearing chains, still holding tools, buried exactly where empire decided to leave them. The condemned of Rome died twice, once in the dark, and once in history's forgetting. The temptation when you encounter something like this is to comfort yourself with distance, to decide that ancient Rome was fundamentally different from anything we would recognize today, that this was primitive barbarism belonging to a world we have evolved far beyond. But that comfort is a lie, and it is worth resisting. What made damnatio ad metalla possible was not ancient barbarism. It was the same mechanism that has enabled systematic cruelty in every era of human history. The decision, made deliberately and maintained consistently, that certain people are not really people, that they are instruments, resources, tools to be used and discarded. The Romans did not experience themselves as monsters. They experienced themselves as civilized, as bringers of law and order to a chaotic world. They built roads and aqueducts and legal systems. They produced art and literature and philosophy that we still study. They made undeniable contributions to the architecture of human civilization, and they built all of it on the bodies of 1 million people they had legally declared to no longer exist. That is the real horror. Not that Romans were uniquely evil, but that they were human. People who convinced themselves that their empire, their prosperity, their civilization was worth the cost of countless lives ground to dust in the darkness underground. Names lost, faces lost, everything lost. The next time you see an image of the Colosseum, remember what it stood above. Remember that underneath the marble and the engineering and the legacy is a system designed to make human beings disappear profitably. Remember the tally marks scratched into stone reaching 237. Remember 2 words carved into a wall in Greece 2,000 years ago. Remember us. If this kind of buried history is what you're looking for, subscribe to the channel right now. This is exactly what we do here. The stories that didn't make it into the textbooks. The history that gets left out on purpose. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you don't miss what's coming next.